Once upon a time, in a small, bustling village, there lived a kind-hearted cobbler named Martin. Martin was known throughout the village for his skill in making the finest shoes. However, despite his hard work, he was very poor. His workshop was tiny, and he had just enough money to buy the leather and materials he needed to make shoes for his customers. One evening, as the winter chill settled over the village, Martin found himself with only enough leather to make one last pair of shoes. "What will I do after this?" he wondered aloud. "If I don't sell these shoes, I'll have no money left to buy more leather." Feeling worried, Martin cut out the pieces for the shoes and set them on his workbench, ready to stitch them together the next morning. With a heavy heart, he went to bed, hoping that something might happen to change his luck. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept into his workshop, Martin was in for a surprise. There, on his workbench, was a beautiful pair of shoes, perfectly made. They were the most exquisite shoes Martin had ever seen, far better than anything he could have made himself. Martin was astonished. Who could have done this? He wondered. It must be a miracle. That day, a wealthy customer visited Martin's shop. When he saw the beautiful shoes, he was so impressed that he bought them immediately, paying Martin far more than what the cobbler had expected. With the money, Martin was able to buy enough leather to make 2 more pairs of shoes. That evening, just as before, Martin cut out the pieces for 2 pairs of shoes and left them on his workbench. And once again, when he awoke the next morning, he found the shoes had been expertly made during the night. Day after day, this mysterious help continued. Each morning, Martin found new, beautifully crafted shoes on his workbench. He sold them all and soon became quite prosperous. But Martin remained humble and grateful, wondering who his secret helper could be. One evening, just before Christmas, Martin decided to stay up late. He hid in his workshop to see who was helping him. He lit a small candle and hid behind a curtain, keeping very quiet. As the clock struck midnight, the door to the workshop creaked open, and in tiptoed 2 tiny elves. They were dressed in ragged clothes, with little bare feet that made no sound as they moved across the floor. The elves climbed onto Martin's workbench and, with amazing speed and skill, began to sew, cut, and stitch the leather. In no time at all, they had crafted the most beautiful shoes Martin had ever seen. Martin was amazed. "These little elves have been helping me all along," he thought. But as he looked closer, he noticed that their clothes were worn and thin, and their feet were bare. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and wanted to do something kind for them in return. The next day, Martin set to work making tiny clothes for the elves. He sewed 2 little shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and 2 small pairs of shoes. He even knitted them tiny hats and scarves to keep them warm. That night, instead of leaving leather on the workbench, Martin laid out the new clothes and shoes for the elves. At midnight, Martin hid once more and watched as the elves came into the workshop. When they saw the new clothes, their eyes lit up with joy. They quickly put on the clothes, dancing around the workshop in their new outfits. They were so happy that they sang and laughed. With one final joyful dance, they dashed out of the workshop, never to be seen again. From that night on, the elves never returned, but Martin didn't mind. The little elves had helped him when he needed it most, and in return, he had helped them too. With the money he had earned, Martin's business continued to thrive, and he became known as the kindest and most generous cobbler in the village. And so, Martin lived happily ever after, always remembering the little elves who had come to his aid when he needed it most.